All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am Joe. He is Nick. And you are listening to the Nick and Joe Show, coming to you on the Think Radio Broadcast Network. And I can say that now because we are actually also live on FM, and the two stations are 102.9 and 102.9 and 104.5. Sorry, I didn't quite get that right. And listen, guys, just want to make sure that everybody understands that the opinions that we, that is to say your show hosts, Nick and I, are expressing do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the management, workers, shareholders, contributors, and everybody else, even the least bit remotely associated with these two radio stations. So, and it's a historic occasion because we expect to expand even beyond this as well. And we have had some temporary glitches at Growing Pains and tonight, and we apologize for those, but I promise you we're going to get them sorted out. One of the glitches that I understand is that for you guys listening on the internet, you've been hearing me and Joe, or not Joe, sorry about that, Nick. You've been hearing me and Nick since we got him on through Skype, having a lovely conversation. But I understand that for whatever reason, Nick's voice isn't coming through on the FM broadcast. So that'll be fixed up pretty soon, but I just wanted to let you know that we were not, for those of you who are listening, thinking, that Benamy guy, who's he talking to? It really it
you sounded a little unsure about that when we first started.
Yeah. You know, I started off by doing a monologue, and in the first hour, because we couldn't get Nick hooked up properly for whatever reason, and just, you know, for those of you who are just tuning in, that's because I'm here at the Think Radio broadcast studio in Ottawa, and Nick is actually in the studio at 102.9 and 104.5 up in Killaloe, which is up in the Ottawa Valley, and he's doing the show from there. But you know, that's why he's like that. And so anyway, I was doing the monologue,
like
and
what?
I'm only thinking of positive things of Nick. I didn't mean to infer.
That's why
anything.
he's like that.
I didn't.
What?
I didn't mean to infer anything negative. But anyway, it's funny because I'm just thinking that those guys who were listening to the monologue, and then all of a sudden I started to talk to this person, and they must be thinking he's gone over the deep end, right, or whatever. Anyway, listen, we're going to just continue here as if everybody can hear Nick. Hopefully the problem will be sorted out very soon. But we have to continue this way for our listeners on the internet, and also for the podcast, for our listeners who are tuning into the podcast later on. So that's my way of explanation. I hope it's good enough for everybody. But good enough or not, that's the way it is. So Nick, and speaking about listeners on the internet, Lynn, why, I'm having this terrible time.
I don't even look like you're one.
I don't know what it is, Nick. Anyway, speaking about our listeners over the internet, I came across a piece of legislation in the States because we have quite a few listeners down south of the border as well, and so I just thought this was really interesting. We didn't talk about this during our pre-production meeting, but it crossed my desk here, and I thought, this deserves a little bit of discussion because it's not irrelevant to us here in Canada. In fact, it's not irrelevant anywhere because it has to do with electric vehicles. And our friend AOC down in the United States has introduced with some other members of the Congress in legislation. I can't remember what the name of the legislation is, but Oh, I know what it is. Right, I've got it written down here. The Electric Vehicle Freedom Act. And the point of this particular bill, if it passes, is to fund the creation of an infrastructure that would make electric vehicles a public service, or the infrastructure of around electric vehicles. And what that means is the hydro, the electricity distribution, and the electrical outlets for people to plug into as some kind of a public service. Now, I haven't read the bill, so I don't know precisely what's included in it. When they talk about it being a public service, are they talking about creating the infrastructure as a public service? I don't know that that's necessarily the best thing. If we look at gas stations for cars, fueling stations for cars and trucks and other motor vehicles, all of that was developed by the private sector, and it works very well. If we look at another example here, going from the other direction, Nick, remember the days when telephones were a public service? Now, we had to still call and order a phone. It wasn't like the government was coming down and giving us a phone and they were paying for it. We still had to pay for our phone service. But just, I don't know, I'm starting to get a little older, and I get to tell people this more and more, Nick. I'm old enough to remember blah, blah, blah. So what I'm old enough to remember here is when you actually had to call and order a telephone through the government monopoly, which in Canada was Bell Canada, and how long it would take for them to actually come and install a telephone in your house. And then, of course, you had to pay for it. But just the idea of how long it took for telephones to develop and for them to be readily available to people. And it really wasn't that the phone revolution, and most houses had phones when I was growing up. We had a party line, which means we didn't have our own telephone line. We just had a distinctive ring. So if someone was calling us, the ring was distinctive, but our neighbors
was one long, one short.
So our neighbors could still listen into our conversations, and us them. So and we had to wait for
the internet before there was an internet.
Exactly, so it was hard to keep secrets back then. But anyway, but I digress. The point is that the whole explosion of communications didn't happen until the government got out of it and basically threw out regulation, and that was in the States predominantly, and outside of Canada. Here in Canada, the cell phone market, for instance, is still fairly regulated, and as a consequence of that, it's very expensive. Nowhere near what it is in the United States. So so the question I have here is, what exactly does it mean when we talk about the infrastructure for electric vehicles being a public service, and do you really want it to be a public service? Is that a good thing? And one final observation, Nick, and then I want to turn it over to you for your comments, and that is that the whole notion of Electric Vehicle Freedom Act is based again on this idea that there was something fundamentally unequal or even racist in the current distribution of electric vehicles and the ability to plug in somewhere.
Well, I read an article today, and I wish I'd held on to it, but what California is finding out They lead the country in electrical vehicle sales, if my information is accurate, is that 1 in 5 electric car owners are returning them dissatisfied. They just don't like them. They don't want them. So I don't know where she's going to find the people who are going, if they're 1 in 5, think about that. That's like 20%. Actually, it's probably more than that. But the point is that this has been forced. This is a forced issue. The marketplace, and again, this is where the marketplace could solve the problems around infrastructure and things if people wanted it. But even in eco-freako California, they know these things aren't going to work, and they have a much nicer climate to operate in than we do. Can you imagine a car running on batteries up here when it's minus 40? Good luck. You know, you're going to go about 20 miles and the battery will be dead. So there's a lot of problems with this, but the idea of paying for the infrastructure, because you're right, I don't remember ordering phones from the government, because by the time I was in a position to do that, I was already in the Navy, and the phones we had were the old dial-up phones on board, and we didn't have to worry about ordering them. Anyway, the point is that this whole idea of the government funding something that has no business funding is where we end up with these massive debts and failed programs. I mean, look, if socialistic governments can't even build a bridge, and I can think of at least half a dozen examples of that exact scenario, what makes them think they're going to be able to install a massive infrastructure program to displace the gasoline-powered car? And there's a reason why we use gasoline, because it gives us the most energy in the smallest package, other than, say, nuclear. And I don't know that anybody wants to put a micro nuke in their car just so they don't have to fuel it except for once every 13 years. The downsides are pretty significant. But this is where these when you let these people around the throttle, things go bad fast. And this is an example of that. There's no upside to this. There's no way that the government's going to be able to make this work because, first of all, they don't have the brightest minds working on the problem. Those are all in the private sector. To work for the government, most people who work in private industry, making, in high-end technology or in business management and things like that, the kind of skill sets you need to do this are all making far more than they could ever make working for the government. So there's just no incentive for them to, you might get one or two that are altruistic and say, for the good of the country, I'm going to do this. But even that burns out after a while, because you see all your efforts go for naught, because the bureaucrats and the bean counters who make the final decisions never see it your way and don't understand the risk involved. So this is going to be another glorified disaster. And by the way, you know what the fastest vehicle in California is right now?
A taxi out of the state?
You're close. A moving van out of the state.
The government in California has passed legislation now that will prohibit the sale of any vehicles, of cars anyway, operating on fossil fuels commencing in the year 2030. So, in less than 9 years, you will not be able to buy a new car in California unless it's an electric car. It doesn't mean that you have to get rid of your gasoline-burning car. That may be coming down the road, but the government has passed legislation that it will prohibit the sale of petrol-burning cars